So we've got a lot of science, but first we have to start with history. Of course, history is very important. It's something that I'm very interested in, but usually war history. But this morning, I think we'll talk a little bit more about parasite history, and the person who's going to present that history is Graham Mitchell. And Graham Mitchell is currently principal of Foresight Associates, which is a company that advises on science and technology, innovation and commercialisation. And currently he is a member of the WEHI board. But before he went into that side of science, he was in fact an active scientist and did his PhD at WEHI back in the 70s, which was a while ago. But he's aged very well because, as you'll see when he gets up, he still looks extremely young. I was going to show a photo, but I decided not to embarrass him. As I said, he started his scientific career at WEHI and did his PhD with Jacques Miller. After a postdoctoral period at Basel Hall Institute in Switzerland, he came back to WEHI. He was appointed as the foundation head of the unit of parasitology, which is now the Division of Infection and Immunity, by the then director Gus Nossel. So he was responsible for the development of the parasitology program at WEHI, and I think it's very appropriate that he is the one that gives us the historical perspective on the parasitology unit at WEHI. Graham.
Well, thank you very much, Alan, and what a great pleasure it is to be back amongst science and the scientists of WEHI. Thank you to the organising committee, Wei Hong and James, for the kind invitation to take on this task of helicopters are in the news at the moment, a helicopter view of parasites, but broadly infectious disease research at WEHI, particularly that period when WEHI got back into infectious disease via parasites in the mid-70s, as Alan said, in the Nossel regime, and to talk a bit about the first decade and a half of that. But, of course, I have to say that I've been involved. You know, you've got a certain age when the only thing you're asked to do is to give a historical perspective. And it actually works out that I've been involved with WEHI for exactly 50 years to the day. In mid-1975, mid-1965, as a final year vet student, I wrote to Gus Nossel. I was writing an essay on the thymus at the time. Could I visit, get the latest and hottest? All the literature seems to be around, this is when I was in Sydney. Jumped on a train, came to Melbourne. The new director, Gus Nossel, gave me the Cook's tour, exhausted by the end of the day, but I got all this information and wrote a pretty good essay, I think. And of course, that visit led to PhD studies with Jacques Miller in the 66, 69, our T-cell, B-cell discoveries, which Phil Hodgkin was kind enough to mention as a WEHI discovery, with which I was honoured to be associated. Now, any discourse on the history of infectious disease research at WEHI over 100 years could well start with Burnett, Fenner, Eric French et al. On virology in the 30s through to the 50s. And indeed, that is the case, but there's a big surprise, a very big surprise of infectious disease research at WEHI in the 20s. And what was that? So here is, of course, SAMAC and virology's huge contributions in influenza, including the method of production used in the annual vaccine to this very day. Not forgetting, of course, his work in the 30s. Mel Cohen, Phil Hodgkin again, was reminding me of Mel Cohen's view that Burnett's greatest contributions were in bacteriophages, lysogeny, etc., 20 years ahead of its time, and other things which Burnett and his associates were involved in when the institute was virology. Certainly these his books on the natural history of infectious disease, that selection for a virulent organism, not a WIMP, not in a balanced host-parasite relationship, a selection for a virulent organism and host resistance. And resistance in many host genotypes. A dead host, of course, is a dead parasite, beautifully shown by Frank Fenner in myxomatosis. There's not selection for an avirulent organism, there's selection for virulence, but also selection for host resistance in many genotypes in that balanced host-parasite relationship. And those writings certainly determined a lot of our early activities when we reinitiated parasitology or infectious disease research at WEHI in the mid-70s. And of course, as Phil was talking about yesterday, the dramatic switch in 1957 to immunology, his fascination with the booster response, and of course the clinical selection theory, etc., autoimmunity and tolerance. But of course, this was not the infectious disease, this is not the immunology of infectious disease, this was basic cellular immunology. And that dominated much of WEHI's immunology agenda during the Nossal regime. Now, I said there's a surprise. Australia, of course, has a rich history of parasitology research, with discovery of a few medical parasites, but of course veterinary parasitology dominated because of the economic importance of parasites in Australian extensive livestock industries, sheep and cattle in particular, and that extended through to vaccines. But there's a surprise here, which my colleague, well known to many of us, Marshall Lightowl, has reminded me, that in fact, the first description of the hydatids, which was also mentioned yesterday, hydatids, was through Harold Dew, Sir Harold subsequently, who described the life cycle of this, of course, a veterinary and a medical parasite, hydatids. But in the 1920s, Neil Fairley, later Sir Neil as well, and Dew worked on malaria and schistosomiasis. And so, Emmanuel, if we added Leishmania there, that was the research agenda of the Hall Institute in 1990. Guess what? It was sort of back there in the 1920s. That was a surprise. And as I say, that work in particularly veterinary parasitology did lead through, it extended to vaccines and a bit of immunology. But at the time, parasitology had that ye olde worldy sort of feel about it. Very low technology, some achievements, I won't go through them, but sort of vaccination for sure, a bit of a touch of immunology there somewhere. But when Gus and I initiated the program 40 years ago, in 1975, our program was going to have a different flavour. Fortunately, starting off with immunology, but then progressing rapidly to molecular approaches and the quest for molecular vaccines. And there's importantly this integration of disciplines, which started with immunology because that was the dominant theme of the Hall Institute, even though Don Metcalf's, we heard from Tony and others yesterday, Don Metcalf's program was building in the 70s, but immunology still dominated WEHI with Jacques and Gus and Ken Shortman and others. Autoimmunity, of course, around with Ian Mackay. So we start with immunology, but rapidly with Robin Anders joining the group, immunochemistry. You can't study immune responses to parasites. This looks good. This looks good. This looks good. Help. With Robin Anders joining the team, sort of a detailed analysis of the parasite, of the antigens of parasites, and then, of course, integration with around Dave Kemp, molecular biology, transforming the field of parasitology with that molecular biological sort of component, and then, of course, not forgetting the not everything is a protein, glycolipid and carbohydrate antigens around Malcolm McConville and Emanuela Handman, particularly in a Leishmania context, leading through now, for that slide sort of eventually comes up, just mind-boggling visualization sciences and what you guys can do now. In that last talk we were listening to, the visualization, the intracellular events, that's it, thank you. And something equal now when I come back to WEHI and look at what goes on here and the cell biology and the trafficking of molecules and cells, it's comparable to the excitement which was up here in the molecular biology as the field was being transformed by the activities of my colleagues in the parasitology program here at WEHI. Okay, so we, of course, good funding support enabled this program to grow, and it became the largest program, single program within WEHI in the about 1990. And this growth from nothing in 75 to that sort of aggregate of people. Fantastic technical support. I want to emphasise that, not just superb scientific staff, but this technical and adding the centralised services that you have here at WEI, just brilliant. But I want to also emphasise this here, long before we were able to catalyse external funding, Gus Nossal and the Institute funding we had, the Institute supported the entire endeavour for 3 to 4 years so we can get some runs on the board. I stayed home the whole time, make sure that sort of when we were going out here to these funding agencies, we had something to talk about. And that was the investment which the Hall Institute put into us. This funding that we were able to secure, fantastic funding from the US, particularly the Rockefeller Foundation, MacArthur Foundation. John Boothroyd here was a beneficiary of this, but the Australian government, of course, and TDR. And a couple of slides. I've started off modestly with 2 postdocs and a couple of PhD students. You'll recognise the Dean of Science there across the road, and you'll recognise a former head of the College of Pharmacy up the road, Colin Chapman and Karen Forsyth, Russell Howard and Emanuela. And of course, this is halfway up that slope when we sort of haven't got a slide of the totality, but you'll see you'll recognise a few characters here. There's a sad-looking fellow here, sort of our chairman. This experiment must have been working that well that day, Alan. But more particularly, we were able, with that Rockefeller funding, to get where parasites are and to recruit the Philippines, Uganda, a PhD student with Emanuela, and Huang Songru, a fellow from China. You'll see in the background, those with a keen eye will see a Papua New Guinean here. John Matthews, another might be able to recognise one. And the map of Papua New Guinea there. This must have been taken in Graham Brown or Robin Anders's office. That key collaboration with Papua New Guinea and with the Philippines in schistosomiasis. We painted on a large canvas. We initially brought into the program a large number of parasite systems, either mouse or veterinary human parasites in mouse models, etc., addressing a variety of questions, as well as, of course, as we'll see in a moment, the dominance of malaria and the quest for a malaria vaccine. But other human parasites as well, as this is Babesia bovis, a forerunner of much of our activity in the malaria field, was in this parasite in Australia, where there is a vaccine, an avirulent form of the parasite. Now, for a cellular immunologist in WEHI, getting involved with these parasites, this was paradise. This was paradise for a mouse immunologist working in WEHI. And I'll give you 3 examples of that, of these 3 parasitic systems here, which led to a particular source of information. Of course, we were the first group to bring monoclonal antibodies into parasitology as diagnostics for detection of antibody or antigen. And of course, these very many parasite systems which we haven't got time to go into and are not really relevant, all were used for various things. Eosinophilia, the T-cell dependence of IgG1, hypergammaglobulinemia, granuloma formation, sort of, et cetera, et cetera. We could study these phenomena, these host versus parasite responses in various systems. But let me just give you a taste of what why this was paradise for myself in particular. Here are, this is the parasite larval cestode, Taenia taeniformis. The only difference between this resistant mouse and that susceptible mouse is that this mouse rapidly produces complement-fixing antibodies to clobber the parasite before an anti-complementary activity is generated by about day 7, 8, 9 by the parasite, an immune evasion mechanism which thwarts this host protective antibody, which is there, but reaches a biologically relevant titer too late. The parasite wins the race in that case and loses the race in this case. That simple host-parasite relationship, beautifully, of course, exploited by a colleague I mentioned before, Marshall Lightollers, in developing the only molecular vaccine at the moment in sheep and pigs which has 100% efficacy, 95% efficacy in the field and 100% efficacy. Things are different in the field, as you know, versus the laboratory. But there's a brilliant, and the glittering prizes will come to Marshall Lighthowlers pretty soon, because he has achieved the goal of effective, 95% effective molecular vaccine against a parasite. The second system is with Emmanuel Hammond, who brought Leishmania major into the laboratory in the mid-70s when we started the program. Here the lesion score inject with the infective stage here, a BALB/c mouse highly susceptible, a nude mouse, of course, equally susceptible. Give a nude mouse a small number of T cells, and the thing is highly resistant. Worked every time. Give it the normal complement of T cells, and of course it approaches the BALB/c mouse, highly susceptible. The difference here seemed to be an interplay between disease promoting IL-4 production, best explained by, but not proven, IL-4 production versus gamma interferon production. The frequency of gamma interferon producing cells, T cells, being greater than the frequency of the disease promoting IL-4. But the one I think which is to particularly focus on is Schistosoma japonicum, our collaborative work in the Philippines, where we identified our strategy of lining up the mouse strains, identify a resistant one and a susceptible mouse strain, and determine an immune response which correlated with that resistant phenotype. And here we have a resistant strain 129 responding to antigens in this region of the gel, work of Kathy Davin, and not being recognised by a susceptible BALB/c mouse. This, of course, this is from an expression library created by Rob Saint, was identified by Donald Smith as glutathione S-transferase, 28 and a 26 molecular weight GST. And of course, we were looking at that as a vaccine. Induce that sort of immune response in this susceptible mouse, would we have a vaccine? However, of course, the brilliance of Donald Smith was taking that, identifying it as glutathione S-transferase, and developing an expression vector, PGEX, involving a hybrid molecule, one-step purification on a glutathione column. That was Donald's achievement. This paper, 1988 paper from Donald, is the most cited paper in WEHI's 100-year history, and it is also the essence, the very start, certainly the first commercial income to the parasitology program, one of the very early sources of commercial income to the WEHI. This is John Stocker, my two Foresight colleagues, and I think my other colleague, David Pennington, is also in the audience, the makeup of Foresight. But here in '89, 1 year after Donald's seminal paper, great discovery, great invention, WEHI starts reaping the benefits. And of course, Donald reaped some benefits as well. Okay, but it was the malaria program, of course, which in that period dominated. And the list of achievements, I would just sort of leave this here for a moment. When you look down this list, starting with Graham Brown cultivating the parasite, and then this is the eureka moment. You said, Phil yesterday kindly put me together with Dave in this eureka moment. No, I was an observer, very much off to the side. This is Anders, Brown, Kemp, Koppel, Cowman, etc. This eureka moment. But you look at this list. It goes on and on. Now, those with a keen eye will note that there's not a dot point here which says safe, effective, affordable, registered malaria vaccine. Unfortunately, I couldn't fit that on the slide. But I think you'd have to say, what a list, what an achievement. And as I say, that eureka moment, I think looking at this one, Ellen, the reason I wasn't in that is my beard wasn't bushy enough. When you look at this, of course, Robin Anders, Dave Kemp, Ross Koppel, pictured there, and the eureka moment of expression of malaria antigens in E. coli in the early 80s, which sort of was the seminal event in the parasitology program to that date. Okay, reflections, Alan and colleagues, just wrapping up. Our timing in this bringing back into the Hall Institute infectious disease research, which of course endures to today, the timing was perfect. the world was sort of starting to think, well, all these great neglected diseases, these scourges of mankind, afflicting those people, the people most in need, the ones least able to pay, and not being beneficiaries of this revolution in biology. What the hell's going on? And so Rockefeller, MacArthur, NIH, sort of WHO, et cetera, research training. I think the legacy of this program, I think when the history is written one day, will be, here are the PhDs granted in the 1980s. Now, of course, there's many more after this time. But have a look at this. This is what these people, you'll see here directors of institutes, you'll see here deans of science, you'll see deputy deans of medicine, you'll see a whole variety of people who have really made a huge contribution to other fields, having cut their teeth in parasitology. PhD students from our endemic country, the third world, Nina with Robin, Wilfred with myself and Shisto, these people getting their PhD and then going back to where the need is really, to get sort of academics back in those endemic countries, having had their training in Australia. And you'll also see here 3 who are deeply involved in commercialisation of translating of research. And of course, that was the other thing. Active translation, the initial name of the program was the Applied Immunobiology program. So active translation was what we were all about. International engagement, of course, I've mentioned that. I'll come back to this right at the end. So Alan was kind enough to, so just ensure history is looking back. What about the current situation? Here, I think we can see another very interesting phenomenon. I hope I've done justice to you here, Alan et al., in capturing what I think is the essence of your division. Now, an additional division being created, of course, collaboration with others, but now a variety of activities, and again, lo and behold, an expansion of the scope and the agenda into other infectious disease, besides to complement the extraordinary activities in malaria, some of which we're about to hear. However, let me go back to this. Gus, and sort of great pity he's not here, I would have liked to have, in a sense, dedicated this to him because he was the one who enabled that growth you saw. Said, Mitchell, go as fast as you can, get to your optimal size, keep bringing the money, but realise when you get to what sort of is an optimal size, don't get any bigger. I want a very nice bit of advice. But he came up with this quote, which I think epitomised the malaria program, the parasitology program at its most productive. Gus said, the glittering prizes of success come to those who combine teamwork with high technology in a bubbling cauldron of ideas. And of course, the intellectual atmosphere of the Hall Institute sort of enabled it. This was the Hall Institute, I remember. I know it characterised the Hall Institute of the Nossal era, certainly the Corey era, and I now know it will be certainly the Hilton era of get the right team who can collaborate together, multidisciplinarity, invest in high technology so no one will ever be able to go to the director and say, I can't do that experiment because I don't have the wherewithal. And in this bubbling cauldron of ideas where the intellectual atmosphere of the Institute is so paramount, and which we see on display in this symposium. Thank you very much.